got a few people in the queue. I'll just start by welcoming our chamber members to this very timely workshop put on by Colin and Chris. Colin and Chris are from Sales Primer. Thanks for joining us, guys. They're in the business of helping businesses scale up and, particularly in the areas of marketing and sales. And so I think you'll have some really good things to share with us today, helping us navigate tariffs, assessing risk, exploring new markets, leverage government support, etc. And you'll hopefully leave us some really practical tips on what we can do to navigate this very unstable economic environment that we're facing. So welcome, gentlemen, and thank you for the chamber members that have joined us today.
Great, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Craig. First of all, thanks again to Samantha and Craig and the Abbotsford Chamber of Commerce for inviting us to do this. Just one of the reasons why we wanted to reach out was, Chris and I have been attending a lot of the workshops that are online right now, hosted by the BDC and the EDC and the various other sort of agencies that are out there, and they're all sort of rushing to the market with support because of what's happening right now. And a lot of the content's great. But one of the things Chris and I realized was, they often leave you with kind of a laundry list of the kinds of things that you should take a look at doing ultimately, but then they kind of end there. And Chris and I, and so a lot of clients have started to come to us this month ultimately with, okay, well, it's great. Like, we kind of know ultimately what it is we'd like to do, but we don't know how to do it. So Chris, as Craig said, we're very practical. That's what we do. Is we thought actually it would be very timely to approach some of the chambers, put together a workshop like this, and just go over kind of the hows. We're going to do a bit of a summary on the options available, but then we're going to dig right into actually a lot of what Chris and I do for clients, which is really putting it at, to assess a new market and to activate a new market. It's really putting it into action. And so that's why we're here today, basically, is to share some of that experience and try to leave some practical tips for all of you. And just a quick introduction again. Thanks, Craig. I'm Colin McQuinney and co-founder of Sales Primer. I also have a company called Canada Startup, where we specifically help startup and venture firms, and been doing that for about 25 years. And then met Chris, and Chris and I started Sales Primer, I don't know, Chris, maybe 7 years ago or so, but I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, as Colin said, he and I have probably been tag teaming together for about 12 years now in the BC market, and developed a bit of an expertise on really helping companies understand what it takes to build business development models from scratch. So Colin will get into it a little bit more, but we have a very strong background supporting the startup community here in British Columbia. But we're heading into a time now where even established companies right now with the tariff threats are going to need to consider how they may need to pivot into new markets. And the reality is a lot of the best practices that are related to building markets from scratch at a startup, it's very much the same exercise for an established company that now needs to pivot into a new market. And we thought some of the wisdom and then some of the practical sort of approaches, methodologies that we advocate in the startup community, we thought would be equally applicable here for many of you.
Yeah, Chris, do you want to fire up the slide deck at this point, and then
Adam, Jory, Don, just a bit of a heads up. I'm one of those dreadful Mac users, and Mac and MS Teams don't always play ball together. So I'm hoping that you can see the PowerPoint presentation, Sales Primer. We may not be able to put it on full animated display, but as long as you're able to read the deck. Jory, are you able to see this okay?
Beyond the I can see the whole work slide and everything. This is good.
Okay, very good.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Colin. Back over to you, sir.
Yeah, so maybe we'll go to slide 3 here, Chris. And ultimately why we're here, I think we just sort of set the stage for that ultimately. why sales primer. I'll let Chris get into that in a second a little bit more. But really what we'd like to cover with the majority of this is, yeah, the tariffs are going to affect us potentially. So what do we do as far as action items? What should a company do and what priority sort of action steps to take? So we're going to start with actually what we do is help companies, and we suggest this for any firm, really take a look at yourself first of all. How are the tariffs going to affect you if they do? Do a diagnostic snapshot on that. We're going to go over some of the steps to do that quickly, but really just taking a situation snapshot of where your firm's at ultimately, and also where your company or market is at with that, because that certainly indirectly and directly will affect you as well. Once you've done that, ultimately, what are some of the growth options that you need to take a look at? What's available to a lot of companies? And it's not just necessarily jumping to a new market right off the bat. There are other options we're going to take a look at here that, again, using experience with a lot of our clients, they've even done in the last couple months. And then ultimately, if one of those growth options is new market expansion. It's either going to be necessary for a company to do it because they need to replace whatever lost business might happen over the next year or two or short term, or this is just a really good opportunity for the company ultimately to get off their butt a little bit and say, we've been thinking about expanding into the new market. Actually, this is, one of the phrases I heard from a client was, never let a good crisis go to waste. And I mean, ultimately, we saw the same thing with COVID. Is a lot of companies we worked with, because of all the changes going on, they were looking for the opportunities that lent them ultimately, not just the pain it was going to actually cause, but is there an opportunity for the company with their current clients or getting into new markets to where this would actually be the catalyst for it. So that's what we're going to get into, and then I'll hand it over to Chris briefly to get into some of the tariffs.
Yeah, well, let's begin with, I mean, again, why are we here today? Well, I'm guessing most of you, I mean, Craig, there's a chance with you up in the Caribou that you may have missed the headlines, but we're heading into a world where the word tariff seems to be coming up more and more often in the headlines. And it's not just about the aggressive sort of trade actions that the U.S. administration is taking vis-a-vis Canada, but of course other countries are starting to jump in, including China. And I'm heading into my mid 50s. I'm trying to think in the last 5 decades anything that has this level of potential impact on the economy. And really, I mean, as all the politicians are saying, I mean, we really are seeing this as a bit of a threat, a crisis. I mean, it's sort of DEFCON 5. So for each of us, no matter how big or small, no matter what part of the country we're in, no matter what industry we may represent, it's absolutely essential that we step back and say, okay, well, what does this mean for us? What's the impact on each of our companies? What are my response options? And if I don't necessarily think it's going to impact my business directly and immediately, what could it be doing to my customers or my suppliers? Is there a domino effect that may kick in that I should be at least mindful of as early as possible, so that I can mitigate risk that may not show up today, but it might show up in 3, 4, 6 months down the road? So as Colin said, we're going to spend some time talking about how do we build resiliency, and that's going to include conversations around reinforcing our existing book of business. Do we necessarily need to lose business? If there's a percentage of our business that has been coming out of the US, I mean, with these tariffs, does it necessarily mean that we're going to lose it outright? Or are there ways that we can try to fortify it, try to reinforce it in some way? But then also, absolutely, this is an opportunity to step back and say, look, we may still be able to weather the storm in the US, but why not start to investigate other new market opportunities? Again, just to diversify our overall strategy. And what's also exciting is this isn't just about foreign markets. Of course, many of you are probably starting to hear the headlines about the fact that the first ministers across the country working with the federal government are looking to knock away provincial barriers that historically have often prevented a lot of business transactions between, say, BC and Alberta or BC and Ontario. Well, that may be changing. So now really is the time to say, well, look, how could we build out new markets and diversify our opportunities? Last thing I'll share with you is, again, you may not necessarily be feeling the risk of a tariff right now, but because, as Colin said earlier, there is an unprecedented amount of federal and provincial support uh, being put out there now to help companies consider a pivot and consider new markets. Why not explore those opportunities and see whether it does help you to expand your own book of business, even if the tariffs in and of themselves are not a direct threat? So that's why we're here today. And as Colin said, it's not just about the what you should be thinking about, but we really want to try to get into some best practices around the how. What would next steps look like for you, literally in the next day and the next week? Colin, did you want to just jump into?
Yeah, and I think I mean, at the end of the day, again, this is what we love doing. This is what we've done now for 25 years as market expansion with firms. So that's why we think we're qualified to talk about this, and we're going to come up hopefully with some examples that we can use as well. Um, what we're going to do later in the presentation is go through an actual example. We're going to introduce a couple case studies to you. We think that provides really good context for people, not just showing some slides ultimately, but putting that into action. And Chris and I have come up with a couple fictitious companies that we think actually represent two different types of firms. And we're going to run through, we have a tool ultimately that we run our clients through. We're just going to give you a quick example of how we had this case study and what that would mean to them. So the other thing before we move on is very important part of this for a lot of our clients, and maybe some of you as well, is that, this whole thing about getting into new markets, it's about culture as well. Do you have the internal mindset and experience ultimately to be proactive, in a sense, to go out to a market? Do you have the people on board to be able to do that? Do you have experience yourself doing it? So we're going to talk a little bit about that too, because for some of our clients that have come in, they have had very stable markets for a long, long time. They've never really had to go out to a new market ultimately in a long time, ultimately. So part of this is there's an action plan, but you've got to actually figure out the resources you can put together, who are the right people to put on it, for instance, and do we have the mindset and the resources to be able to do this? So we're going to come back actually to that with the case study. All right.
So let's jump into it. Thanks for that, Colin. So look, the question again is where to start. And step one, as we mentioned before, is for each and every one of you, and for the clients who are coming to us, is to do a diagnostic snapshot and assess exactly where we're at right now and determine what could the proposed tariffs, what kind of impact could they have? Now, what's kind of ironic here is some of us have a bit of a muscle memory from having gone through a similar exercise during the global pandemic, because in many ways, this first exercise is an exercise that a lot of companies had to go through when COVID kicked in, and because obviously that caused incredible disruption as it related to supply lines. And so some of the questions were a little bit different, but it really required companies to step back for a second and say, wait a minute, we don't even know exactly how long this is going to last. And so whether it's as it relates to my sales model or my operating model, and on the supply side of things, I better start asking some questions pretty quick if I can't get materials out of China the way I used to be able to. So some of us may still have memory of that exercise. If you've gone through it, it's basically, blow the dust off the playbook because it's time to do it again. And what Colin and I recommend, look, we know every one of you is a business. You're going to be in different industries. You're going to be selling different types of products and services. The particulars of your operations and delivery model are all going to be very different. But the reality is almost all companies at the end of the day need to manage three core functions, which are sales, operations, and finance. And as a heads up, the BDC, the Business Development Bank of Canada, they very much, their management consultants very much come in and evaluate business in the same way. They look at the three buckets, and we often refer to them really as the three C's. Sales is ultimately about what are you doing to to build and retain your customer base. Operations is all about expanding the capacity to support those customers, fulfill on the commitments that you've sold. And then finance is about the third most important C, which is your cash. What is your cash situation right now? And especially when you're heading into disruptive times, it's really, this is the checklist you want to run through, starting with sales. You want to say, well, look, with these tariffs, what is going to happen to my customer base? And if it's not my customer base, what about my customers' customers? And so the first message to you is if you haven't done it in a while, and again, this kind of goes back to a comment Colin made earlier. It's interesting, we've all fallen into this, is if you've been very fortunate with a business that's run sort of smooth and steady for a while, sometimes you step back for a second, you realize, you know what, I haven't actually checked in with my customer base and had a more meaningful strategic discussion with them about where are they going and how is their business working out, and do they have particular growth plans, or in the case of tariffs, are these tariffs going to impact them? And if so, how is that going to trickle back to my operation? Same with distributors. Definitely, because in the case of working with a distributor, you're potentially one step removed from the end customer. So you really want to get on the phone with your distributors and say, look, what are you hearing right now? What could be happening? And all of this is really about evaluating the state of your future orders. Are you anticipating a decline? If so, by how much, how soon, and potentially for how long? But it's not even necessarily about decline. The irony about these tariffs is, for some of you, it may actually represent growth opportunity, because as an example, we're really starting to advocate the whole notion of Buy Canada. Now, there may be some of you who are providing products or services that many Canadian companies would have an appetite for, but for whatever reason, they've been sourcing those products and services from an American provider. Well, because of tariffs and counter tariffs, because of course Canada is now pushing back with counter tariffs, there may be some Canadian companies that have been sourcing opportunities out of the US or sourcing product and service out of the US, where they're looking at that and they're saying, well, that's no longer economically viable. So I may now start to look at just Canadian providers, and it may turn out you may be one of those providers that can help out. So again, this isn't necessarily always about doom and gloom. This could very well be, for some of you, an opportunity to see immediate growth within the Canadian market. But regardless, the message here is get on the phone with your customers, determine to what degree, especially as it relates to the US, to what degree could you see interruption or decline? And or to what degree could you see a transition to, to an increase in Canadian orders? And then eventually, and Colin's going to talk about this some more, start talking about some tactics to protect, whether there's an opportunity for advanced orders or warehousing product. But I'm going to save that for Colin. I'm going to jump into diagnostic snapshot number 2, which is the operations side of things. Just as you should be reaching out to your customers, you should absolutely be reaching out to your suppliers and your vendors, and determining, is there, considering, especially with counter tariffs, is there anything you're sourcing from the US that may now become more expensive for you and no longer viable as maybe a component to a product that you're building? So is there going to be impact on supply? Is there going to be impact on price point? If there is anything that you're sourcing from the US, if the tariff hasn't kicked in, because heads up, I mean, we don't even know entirely what's going to be happening across the board. There's going to be another wave of announcements on April 2nd. And then those tariffs may not be fully administered or kicked in. It may not kick in necessarily for a few weeks. So is there anything you want to stock up early on that you may want to warehouse that you are sourcing from the States? And if so, can you accelerate some advanced orders and potentially on better terms? If you're buying suddenly bulk volume, could you potentially negotiate a better price point on that if you can guarantee that purchase in volume up front? Alternatively, you may need to look at alternate providers. And again, that may mean redirecting your attention to a supplier in Canada, or potentially overseas, or south of the US, getting into Mexico or South America. But again, it's a time to do a reevaluation and a reset. In extreme cases, and we're thinking about in the world of manufacturing, this may even be a time to revisit certain components. Could you potentially be switching out a component, a material component, and looking at introducing something different? And if you do, that may, if it requires retooling, that may have an impact on your production schedule for a while. And again, you may need to circle back and talk to your customers about what that represents. Now, all of this leads to the third and final point, which is finance and particularly cash. No matter what you're up against, whether you may have a US provider that comes to you and says, look, we absolutely do want to continue sourcing material from you, but we need to, and we're willing to order in larger volumes because we want to warehouse some of this, but we want to talk to you about whether you can negotiate on the price here. So whether you're starting to see some impact on your pricing, or whether it has to do with cost management, if you need to switch suppliers and ultimately you're looking at a component that's costing a little bit more for you than it was before, that's going to have an impact ultimately on your margins, your gross margins or contribution margins per transaction, which is about your cash. So either your revenue might get interrupted, or just your margins may experience some kind of a negative impact. It's all about cash. And so you want to do a cash assessment. You want to understand where there could be interruption, where there could be decline. And you want to forecast out. You want to look at the next 3, 6, even 12 months and say, is my cash going to get into a bit of a risky situation? And do I need to fortify that cash? Do I need to look at alternative funding? And here's again where we're hearing some great news, and we'll be sharing these resources with you after the presentation. Almost every one of the federal agencies is stepping in one way or another to help Canadian companies transition through this time. And that includes the BDC with very friendly terms as it relates to working capital and lines of credit. For those of you pivoting into new markets and especially foreign markets, you may be unaware that Global Affairs Canada has a program called the CAN Export Program, where they provide non-diluted funding, so grant money, grants, to help underwrite your pivot into a foreign market. Now, there's a certain amount of eligibility criteria that you need to evaluate. Again, we're going to encourage you to check out their website and understand exactly what that represents. But this is grant money that they make available to Canadian companies to help with that pivot. EDC, the Export Development Corporation of Canada, again, another source of both working capital, and they will ensure your first few transactions with foreign buyers, especially if you're getting into deal valuations in the 6 or 7 figures. That can be a risk if you've never done business overseas, and most especially if you're doing a high ticket deal value with a client you've never worked with before. There's uncertainty as to whether, they are going to fulfill on a payment schedule or come through with full payment. Through the EDC, you can underwrite that risk by, they will insure some of those transactions. These are just examples. Again, we're going to present a whole laundry list of government resources and other associations that are providing a lot of support as it relates to your transition into new markets. So this is step one, is the diagnostic snapshot. And we encourage every one of you, even when you don't think you're being directly impacted by the tariffs, make sure you touch base with your customers, your distributors, and your suppliers and get a sense of their world. Because it could be you're going to feel the effects, the domino effects, maybe a few months down the road that you don't fully appreciate right now. So that's step one. I'm going to pass it over to Colin now to jump into step two, which is pivoting into growth options.
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to say one last thing, actually, to piggyback on that whole idea of communicating with your clients. Some of the really cool stuff that we've seen is, often actually if things are well, it's actually hard to actually connect with a client. You're trying to think of a reason to do it if everything's going well. When something like this happens, it actually provides an opportunity for you to circle back and say, let's connect. And one of the very cool things we're seeing is that some of our clients, and we really encourage this, is can you sit down at the table with your client and look at a strategic plan together over the next year to where you're really partnering on initiatives ultimately? And the more you understand some of the stuff they're trying to do, some of their goals, we've seen some amazing opportunities come out of that for some of the companies we work with that it would have never happened actually if they weren't proactive, making that contact and encouraging the get together, right? So it is a time to sort of, pick up your chair and come on over to the other side of the table with your clients, roll up your sleeves, and let's figure this thing out together. That's a really, really great. There's an opportunity now to do that, I think. Whereas when
and a mentality, Colin. It's a great point. I think a lot of, as Mike Meyer said, we're in an elbows up mentality right now. And I think it's about all of us working as a team. And I think genuinely within industry, Colin, it's a really good point. There's going to be a willingness to collaborate because there's more success to manage this as a team than to try to do it independently.
Yeah, for sure. So, all right. So you've taken sort of a snapshot. Yeah. Oh, yes.
One moment.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I do have to run off to that meeting. I really appreciate what you guys are putting together here, and I look forward
Okay.
to the recording. So
Thank you.
know that I'm here in spirit, and I'm really looking forward to catching up because a lot of our clients are going to be experiencing the impact of this tariff. So
That sounds great. Yeah.
Thanks,
Very good. Thank
Thank
you.
you again.
Thanks. All right. Thanks for
enjoy the day.
Thanks
Cheers.
for checking. All right. Yeah. So you've done a snapshot ultimately of where you're at. Ultimately, see if how much pain you can experience here and potentially some opportunities. One of the things we want to take a look at and what we run clients through is what are your growth options now? And ultimately, we break it into three different topics. One is can you retain some of the business in the US despite the tariffs ultimately? And I think KPMG just recently did a survey last month. And I think we're connecting primarily with larger firms in Canada, but they were asking, are you considering moving any operations ultimately to the US at this point? And I think 48% said yes. So there, part of the first slide here, Chris, if you want to get there, is retaining ultimately. Is there something that you can do with your current U.S. clients, the market that you're in, if it's significant for you, ultimately to maintain a presence down there despite 30% tariffs, ultimately? Because if you can't obviously afford to take that in with your pricing, with your margin, then what are some of the other alternatives open for you? Now, Chris and I are huge proponents of keeping operations here ultimately, but is there something that you can do while you're operating here that again can put a foothold in the States and can circumvent the tariffs in any way? Obviously, the one thing a lot of companies are looking at right now is can we incorporate into the US ultimately, which is not the incorporation itself is not a long process. You'll have a US address, you'll have a US company ultimately. It might be what it is that you need to do to set up down there, but certainly we have clients that have gone that route. Another is there a company down there that we can acquire ultimately or partner with? That's the US channel distribution partner point to where we can operate underneath their umbrella in the States. And again, therefore, the tariffs wouldn't necessarily actually apply to us at this point. There's a company we're working with right now that is an agri company. They make a certain good that they sell into the States. And they're looking at the composition of US and Canada ingredients that go into that. It gets a little complicated, but they're finding a way to actually pivot with their ingredients ultimately and working with their US actually manufacturer and distributor to where their final product can be sanctioned as a made in the US actually product. And then ultimately, can you beat the timing of the tariffs? I think Chris mentioned there were some companies ultimately that we're working with that got ahead of the game and shoves, actually move some product down into warehouses down there that isn't a long-term solution ultimately, but certainly can keep it going and working with a distribution partner down there. We're working with a company right now, a local agritech firm that what they did was they shipped seeds down ultimately, and they have negotiated a deal with a channel partner down there in Washington State to actually keep the pilot lit going for a sense. It's not necessarily going to replace what it is that they're doing but short term, again, they've got some pilots going right now with some pretty significant US firms that they really needed to keep going. They couldn't shut that down for the stage that they were at. So they got on their horse, a couple months ago, and again got their seeds down there and have negotiated with a distribution partner. Their margins aren't necessarily going to be the same short term, but again, they can keep the momentum going, hoping that actually this is not a long-term thing that they're going to need to deal with. So that's something with the US, just taking a look at that and saying, is there anything we can do to actually keep this going ultimately? The other thing is pricing. Can we actually eat the 30% tariff at this point somehow, depending on our margins? And financially, can we get through this in the short term by actually doing that? Or is there an ability to actually up our price for a period of time ultimately that will account for some of that tariff? So all of this needs to obviously be done with your customers and doing some market research. The next stage, the next growth option here is, as Chris was saying, really, really great idea to circle back to your current clients. And part of this is, can we renew agreements right now? And that this might be with Canadian firms, but ultimately, can we go back and really stabilize and have predictive revenue for a period of time, even if that means actually giving preferred pricing to our clients right now to negotiate a longer term deal? Because our accountant's going to love that. They're going to love the predictive revenue that's going to come in from that. And so this is the time we often hear these kinds of negotiations going on, where companies are getting ahead of the game, going back to their clients and seeing if they can solidify something as far as sales orders, so they have a safety net in a sense. We're also seeing actually companies now, again, they may have had plans like this to where is there opportunities with our current clients to upsell them with something? And I'm going to mention cross-selling here too. Do we have other complementary products or services that we can provide the clients? And now is a really good time, especially if we understand some of the goals and initiatives that they're actually working on right now. Can we add value to what it is that we're already doing with them and charge a premium or get more wallet share, right, from them based on that, but we're helping them again reach their goals, or even actually uncover new markets, for instance, with what it is that we can provide for them. And can we expand our product line at this point to where we can help actually that whole process? We often say with clients, the low-hanging fruit is not necessarily go to a new market right now. It's check with your current customers and see what else they need, and can you provide that? And it's often actually, once you do that, there's really, really good short-term opportunities actually for some cash flow. We read a story ultimately about an Abbotsford blueberry farmer. I don't know if you know them. I don't even know the name. It was just a generic Abbotsford blueberry farmer. But the story in business in Vancouver was that they expanded their product line ultimately, and from jams into more jams and juices. And I thought that's a perfect example, right? Is that what are we capable of doing as far as we've got the ingredients for this. Maybe they had been thinking about this for a while, and the catalyst was now to really actually move forward on something like that, increase their product line and ultimately see if they can get some more business from their current clientele. So just a couple things there is just reinforcing your current clients, and are there opportunities there with them? And that's just a few options to take a look at. Chris? Now, you've looked at the US. Is there anything we can do there? You've looked at your current clients. Is there anything that we can do there? For some of you, and for certainly for a lot of our clients, it is time ultimately that they need to look at expanding into new markets, whether that's domestic Canada or into foreign ultimately. So we're just going to cover actually the next few slides here are a list of criteria. We call it expansion criteria that, the reality is you don't want to jump into this. This is going to cost you time. It's going to cost you money. And you really want to make sure ultimately that if you're looking at getting into a new market, that you have got a checklist that you're going over that is consistent, that you stay to, and ultimately to make sure that if you're going to make that effort and throw resources against it, that you have mitigated the risk in a sense of going in there. You've gone through the research, you've gone through the process, and you feel that it's worth actually the risk to actually go ahead and do it. So here's just a couple things. The next two slides are some criteria that we use with our clients to assess a new market. One is market viability. Ultimately, for the market that we focus in, for the target market that we're working in right now, the people that are buying our services and products, how many of them ultimately are represented in this new market that we're going after? And is that substantial enough for us to make it worth it for us? You're not going to sell all of them ultimately. You'll probably sell a percentage of them if you're fortunate. So does that even make sense? Are there enough of them there that really fit our market that we go after and had success in? What kind of competition is there ultimately? Are we going to be faced with some pretty stiff competition? And do we even have a differentiator with that? Are we able to ultimately, do we have a price actually advantage there that we can go into? Do we have a quality advantage? How do we differentiate from them? The next is taking a look at regulatory legal. The big one here is, do we have a free trade agreement with the country? And there's a list ultimately in one of the links that we'll send you that goes over the countries that Canada has an agreement with already. Another big one, if you have a product, though, is certifications. Europe, for instance, is very, very tight on this, and it's doable ultimately, but your product needs to have the CE sanction, basically saying that you have passed all the requirements for health and safety, etc., to be able to sell it. So, what is that process and how much is that going to cost you and how long does that take, obviously, is something you need to take a look at. Logistics and supply chain, shipping costs, big one, ultimately. Certainly, if you need to ship a product overseas now, ultimately, it's going to be more expensive and the timing of that's going to be actually challenging potentially. And then what are the logistics network within the country that you're thinking of going to? So that's really comes down to ultimately what's the extra cost this is going to be to get the product there and in the hands ultimately of the end user. Next slide. Sales to distribution strategy. What channel do I need to use here? Can I sell direct to the customer that's going to buy this? Or do I absolutely have to find a channel partner or a distributor in this firm or in the region ultimately? And how is my pricing going to be different here? What are people paying for the product or service right now? Does that make sense to me based on the new costs I'm going to incur? And ultimately, where does that position me, which gets into marketing? And do I have a realistic position here in the market based on what my value proposition is? Am I high quality, high price? Am I low price, good quality? What is it that I stand for? And is that needed in the market right now? Is there an opening for me here ultimately in that? And how am I going to generate awareness and prospects ultimately. And some of that gets into cultural considerations and language, obviously, right? So a lot of research there if you're going into an international market. And then finally, financially, once I'd gone through all of this and really started putting together some costing around what this is going to take to enter this market, and you've got an initial budget, is that even feasible for us, considering what kind of margins that we can still get out of this based on the price that we can charge? And what's the runway that this is going to take, right? You're not going to necessarily sell in the first week. The more complex the product, the longer the sales cycle. And it gets back to Chris's assessment of your financial capabilities here, and do we have the runway to actually do this? Because sales may not start to come in with it, for the first 6 months, for instance. Can we withstand that? Do we have the working capital and the runway to be able to do that ultimately? So all of that is a really, really good, strong checklist. And what Chris and I are going to send to you afterwards as well with the PowerPoint, the recording is we put together a couple case studies. As I said, we're going to jump into it here, but that list I just sent you gets a lot more detailed ultimately. For the sake of being brief here, we just covered a couple of the things, but that criteria list actually is a little bit more extensive, and we'll share that with you after. The last thing, and then we'll jump into the case study, is okay, well, yeah, the market looks good, but again, we mentioned this earlier. Now you need to internally assess this, and Chris, digging into the tools, going to get into this a little bit of what kind of resources this is going to take your firm to actually do a proper job of this. But first of all, just company culture. Some clients come into us, and they need to expand. They need to get into a new market. The reality is they either have never done a proactive sales process, or they haven't done it in a long time. And they may not have the culture ultimately, that sort of hunter versus harvester sort of culture, right? And so that's a thing to think about too, is if we're going to do this proactively, do we have the people internally that have the mindset to do it? And if not, do we need to do some training here or bring somebody else that does? Which often happens with some clients that we have. This can't be done off the side of your desk. A lot of companies are doing like, the COO or the CEO is either running a company, or the VP of sales has got, their whole other job, but they're also tasked to actually see what we can do with this new market, and they're doing it off the side of their desk. That doesn't work. Believe me, it's not going to have the focus or the priority that's required ultimately to make that work. So we just wanted to say that too. And again, Chris is going to go through a process to look at resources here quick. So ultimately, again, it's really taking a look internally of, do we even have the wherewithal to do direct sales, or do we absolutely have to do a distributor actually route here, because we don't have the wherewithal to do it direct. We don't have salespeople here, etc. And ultimately looking at the language thing as well. So just wanted to say it is part of the assessment. It is part of what companies should do, is look internally and say, are we set up even for this? Okay. Case study. So
Hey, Colin,
yeah.
I had a question.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm not sure if we should have established at the beginning, you want them during or at the very end?
Well, we actually have this is actually a good time, but we have in the next couple slides, Chris is going to fire up a tool, and we were going to take a question break then.
Okay.
If you want to wait, does that work?
Yeah, works good.
Awesome. Okay. So we're going to show you how this is going to work. A fictitious company called Maple Tech Tools. They're a mid-sized manufacturer. They're a mid-sized manufacturer in Canada. They make high precision tools. A big market for them is the automotive one. They're also very popular in other industries. The tariffs are going to affect them big time. So while the majority of their sales has happened in Canada and the US, they've done the analysis. They absolutely need to find a new market. And based on some trade shows that they were at historically, that type of thing. Germany is on their radar. So we're just going to look and go through that checklist of how they would assess Germany as a market. And again, this is very, very high level. We have a case study we can send you where this gets into a lot more detail for Mapletech. Market viability, they feel that Germany shows promise. Ultimately, I think there's 800,000 mechanics ultimately in automotive and industrial markets there. So fairly good size market ultimately, but because of that, it's very competitive. Their research shows, though, that their tools are a little bit more in the high end. So they feel that there is a chunk of that market that they can go after with their value proposition, case studies, etc., that will land them some deals ultimately. But they really need to differentiate themselves ultimately, as that says. Regulations they checked out, they're manageable, but they ultimately do need to go through product testing and that CE certification, which is going to add some time and money to actually market entry. So they need to take that into account for final decision. Logistics and supply chain, I think shipping costs, when they research it, are going to be 30% more than what they were to the US. So that's significant ultimately. And so they need to start thinking about a local partner to reduce those costs. Sales and distribution strategy, going to be ultimately, they probably need to go the distributor route based on all of this. But from what they've heard and a couple initial conversations with distributors, they really want to see that this can sell in Germany before the distributor will take them on, which means that they probably need to do some direct sales first and need to get some clients first to prove ultimately that this is working, and then go back to distributors to try to land one for them. Marketing and branding fit, they're going to focus big time on high-end precision branding. And again, they need to find some German language support. And finally, financially, it's going to cost them about $180,000 to enter the market. Chris is going to walk through quickly how that actually looks in our tool ultimately, but it's high. And so they better actually feel pretty good about the promise of this market, because it's going to actually cost them some cash here. And then to activate this thing, we're going to get, they've decided ultimately to go forward with this. It's worth the risk ultimately. They've got the budget to afford to do this. So what kind of steps do they need to take to activate? I'm going to hand this over to Chris actually in a second here, but they really need to get down to sales ops now and figure out, okay, if we need to go into Germany directly initially and land some customers, what's the process to do that? And first of all, it's really about setting a goal. What's going to prove to us that this is even worth it? At the end of the day, do we need to set a financial goal to say, at the end of 12 months, for instance, we need to land this many customers, we need to achieve this amount of revenue to actually say to us, this is worth it, we can build on this, and we've got enough now to go back to a distributor with. And Chris?
Yeah, and Craig, we're just about 2 slides away, and then we're going to transition into the tool and show you how Mapletech, really kind of worked out on a granular level what this market activation plan should look like and how much it should cost. So just give us a moment, about 2 more slides. On the note of goal setting, and look, this is different for every company, but one of the things you absolutely want to avoid whenever embarking on a new campaign, and we see this a lot, is the mentality of, well, let's just sort of set things up and give it a shot, but without really having a strategic end game in mind. Now, when I say that, I mean, common sense would tell you that's maybe not the wisest approach. Most people want to have a bit of a roadmap in mind, but to really get a bit more granular on this, a sales team really does need a very precise target to shoot for, and they need it for a number of reasons, because as you're going to see in a minute, every sales process is designed stage by stage with certain pipeline metrics in mind. Sales reps really need to understand very carefully and need to track and monitor how are their conversions managing as they go through as leads go through the pipeline one stage at a time. Because they want to get a sense of the volume of activity they need to generate in order to get to a particular sales goal. And that, as you can see, leads to the next question, which is, well, in order for me to reach a goal, I really need to get a sense of the total volume of leads I need to engage in order to increase my probability of achieving that goal. And that then leads to a discussion about the effort to manage that volume of leads, as well as team size and composition. And then ultimately, all of this drives a discussion about a very precise budget, as well as success metrics. So in order for a sales team to properly formulate this whole effort and really come up with a step-by-step activation plan, it's critical for leadership to establish a goal up front that has strategic rationale. And so going back to Mapletech tools, as Colin said earlier, the experiment here, and again, actually, just a reminder, this is all about just evaluating the scenario. Mapletech hasn't even necessarily committed to the German market yet. As Colin said, they've run through a strategic assessment to say this would be one of the next natural markets we should probably consider. But now let's get into a bit of a deeper dive about the effort to activate. So they're going to the sales team now and the sales manager and saying, look, we're thinking about a pilot activation into the German market. The end game is ultimately to convince one or more distributors within Germany to drive our product. But we know it's going to be much easier to get those distribution dialogues up and running if we can prove out the market directly ourselves. And so we're running a scenario where hypothetically, we're trying to generate about 250,000 in net new revenue. And we're choosing that number because we know the average starting point for a client's engagement with us is about a $50,000 minimum commitment in order to purchase our suite of products. That's on the lower end. That's sort of the scale of engagement. So we're trying to figure out what would it actually take to close 5 new clients in Germany at a rough deal valuation of 50,000. And now we're gonna go back to this list. We're gonna say, well, if that is the goal, then what does the sales team need to do to step back and say, okay, well, what's the sales process we're designing around this? What are the pipeline metrics and the lead volume and lead generation plan to get there? And how much of our team effort do we need to dedicate to this? Is this something a single rep can do? Is it a full team effort? So I'm going to pull up our sales primer. We refer to it as our sales readiness tool. And while I'm doing that, Colin, I'll let you and Craig talk through that question there while I switch gears here.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Craig.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, guys. And I'm going to go back before this segment to the developing new product. Like you gave the example of the blueberry farmer creating jams. It wasn't clear to me, is the objective obviously to create, value-added products, but is it to find products that are non-export kind of potentials, or something that would add value as an export in a different way, or avoid tariffs in some of the nuanced rule regulation?
Yeah, no, totally get why you asked that. I think ultimately, and again, I'm going to use an actual example of a client here. They want to build it for the US market, but they've got Canadian customers that they can actually test this on first. So we are very big advocates on, like, for instance, if you're going to introduce a new product line, do you have current clients ultimately that you can test it on ultimately before you put a lot of money in to actually expand it big time? So in their case, they are going to test it on the Canadian clients first ultimately, with the hope, Greg, that the U.S. market will open up, and by that time, actually, they will have they will, really refine ultimately the product and the process actually. So in that case, that's what we're doing. I don't think we haven't run into a case where they're restructuring. Other than that, there was one company again. They were looking at the ingredients. Ultimately, can they get ingredients from elsewhere? Ultimately, than from the U.S. at this point to continue actually providing it at the price that they want to. But ultimately, that's what we meant by that is the product line with a current market that you can test it with, aside from the tariffs.
Right. Yeah, thanks. And it strikes me as a really important point, kind of aside from tariffs, in that, we know Canada needs to do a lot more in terms of developing value-added products and secondary and further products in the market because we just export way too many things that are very raw in nature
Right.
and so creating the value and then exporting them would, I think, be a good value proposition for businesses.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think again, just listening to you, that's a value proposition for the government resources that are out there as well. They are big. Yeah. They want to see that because they want to see that creates jobs, that creates opportunities here ultimately when the finished product is here. So I think that lends well ultimately to what they want to be aligned with as well.
Yeah,
and we're absolutely hearing that messaging from politicians across the country, both at a provincial level and also coming out of Ottawa. And I mean, of course, we know leadership may very well change within 4 to 5 weeks, but I think regardless, the overall sentiment in Ottawa right now is, again, this is a recognition that the way we've allowed our economy to evolve, there are some risks. Some of it is our extreme dependency on the United States as our primary trading partner. But another risk, Craig, as you well pointed out, is, I mean, we as a country, we are primarily known for exporting raw material, which means a couple of things. First off, we're losing all of the great margins that come from, producing secondary, product. But it also means that there's a lot of risk there because we're not diversifying or strengthening our economy. So this is the time, and politicians are mindful of this. And as we mentioned, there are already resources being put towards this, both at a provincial and federal level, which is great to see.
Yeah, another good example of some of the intended consequences of something like tariffs, right? It's not all bad. It's causing causing us to take stock of our interprovincial trade barriers and manufacturing and so forth, which is good.
That's right. Don't what did Colin say earlier? Don't miss out on a good crisis opportunity.
There you go. Yeah,
that's right. So look, thanks for that, by the way, Craig. So
are there any? Does anybody else have any other questions before we move on? Or are we good to go? All right. We should have some time at the end too.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, you bet. And thanks again, everybody, for sitting through all this. We're switching gears now, and what we're doing is we're pulling up our sales primer application, and this is the tool that we use and the methodology that we use, sitting with clients to model through different sales scenarios. And so we've created a sort of a mock scenario here for Mapletech tools. And Colin had mentioned earlier that Mapletech was, investigating the German market, and that they had established that the budget potentially to test this market could be as much as $179,000, $180,000. I mean, the question though is, well, where did that number come from? How did they set that budget as a minimum? And it's also part of the reason why it drove the $250,000 initial target in terms of just making sure this is a viable exercise and worth the investment. And so we're going to walk you through how a company actually breaks all this down and how they get a sense of operationally what's required to get it done. And so we're back in the sales primer tool. And first and foremost, you're going to see here that we're running a scenario where we have a hypothetical goal. Mapletech is looking to generate $250,000 out of its new market in Germany at an average deal value of about $50,000. So very simple straight line math. The question is, what would it take to drive 5 new deals in that market over the next 12 months? We'll give it a year to try to get this up and running. So that's the goal. Very simple math, but you're going to see that that math drives a really important discussion for the sales team and for leadership. And it starts with an evaluation of the sales process and ultimately a measurement of the pipeline metrics to get this done. And so leadership is now sitting down with the sales team and saying, right, okay, let's revisit when building new business from scratch, what is our typical sales process? And what you're looking at here is sort of a standard stage by stage business development process, running from beginning with suspect leads, getting into a more robust discovery call, which ultimately leads to an invitation to submit a proposal, and then close deals, and you've got a certain number of customers you're managing after the fact. Now, what leadership does know is, because quite often leadership does get involved in the latter stages of the sales exercise, they kind of know off the top that usually about 1 out of every 2 proposals, they're successful in closing. They often do get into sort of a competitive bid situation, but historically in North America anyhow, because of the quality, durability, and reliability of the tools, they're a well-known brand. They usually get on the short list, and usually 1 and 2 proposals are closed, which means working backwards, and we often refer to this as backcasting your pipeline to really understand all of your metrics. What this is telling leadership at Mapletech is, well, look, if we want to close 5 deals in Germany, at the bare minimum, we need to make sure we're getting 10 proposals out over the next year, or almost 1 a month as a starting point. So that's moving back. But then the next question is leadership sitting down with sales and they're saying, well, look, not every conversation leads to a proposal. So historically, right now, roughly what percentage of discovery calls do you find leads to the permission and the opportunity to submit a proposal? And they found historically in other markets, it's about 1 in 4 discovery calls ultimately leads to the invitation to submit a proposal for bid. So now we're starting to learn a little bit more about our pipeline metrics. What we're starting to realize is, well, look, we need to make sure that we've got a team up and running and the resources in place to facilitate as many as 40 discovery calls with 40 different potential prospects in the greater German market. But that's as it relates to actually having a willing conversation with a company that's raised their hand and said, yes, I'd like to actually learn a little bit more about you, Mapletech. But before you even get to that stage, there's some research that needs to be done to even just identify what are the suspected leads out there that are worth targeting directly. And we'll get into how you target those companies. But it often takes a bit of door knocking before you even have the opportunity to sit down and have even a meaningful initial conversation. And again, the sales team has told us that historically in other markets, it usually only about 1 in 5 leads that you approach ultimately respond in the positive and say, yeah, you know what, you've got a curious set of tools here, and we are thinking about re-equipping some of our facilities. We'd like to talk to you about it. So now we're looking at a full set of pipeline metrics. And again, this is why it's so essential to start with a specific goal, because this deal value count of 5 is ultimately what drives the whole rest of the sales process and the pipeline metrics. And it ends up with a very clear understanding that one of the things you need to confirm before you truly commit to the German market, are there in fact at least a minimum of 200 doors you can knock on, 200 different potential prospects or clients in the German market, in the automotive industry or related industries that might be interested in using your tool. Now, what we've discovered working with Colin, who's led the market assessment, is yes, actually there's more than 200 companies in central and southern Germany that are, the sort of the heart and soul of the automotive industry over there that would absolutely want to take a look at our tools. So that's encouraging. But now we need to determine, well, yes, but wait a minute, how do we generate those 200 leads, and how are we engaging those 200, and could we be engaging even more than 200 just to mitigate our risk? And the short answer is that in order to make this happen quickly, through a number of directory lead lists and through some lead list purchasing strategies, Mapletech knows it can get its hands on 200 contacts. So the ideal customer profile of engineering managers at these various different companies, and come up with a lead list of 200 companies and multiple contacts within those companies, and set up a drip campaign that usually includes a combination of direct outreach with LinkedIn, email, and direct calling. So at the very least, they're going to front end that sales development effort. But they've also done a bit of research, and they've identified, you know what, there's actually at least 2 industry events we should consider participating in that are, one is in Munich and one is in Hanover at certain times of the year. Absolutely are a big draw for the kind of targets we're going after. And we think, based on our experience participating in other trade shows, there's a good chance we can probably get 10 leads out of each of those events. They're also entertaining the possibility of promoting some webinars, speaking about their particular product, but also some new and emerging best practices around their technology, some of which is driven by artificial intelligence. Their latest set of tools does a lot of automation on the assembly line, and a lot of that incorporates new practices in terms of artificial intelligence, fault detection, and analysis on the assembly line. And they think that they can actually host a number of webinars to speak to the better practices of introducing artificial intelligence on the assembly line. So not just selling their product, but really coming across as thought leaders in the space. And again, their past experience hosting these kind of webinars is they often get about 5 inquiries per webinar. They also realize that they work hard at this, that there probably are some referrals that they could network. And then always they tend to get inbounded. Not a significant amount, but if they drop a little bit of money on paid advertising and search engine optimization, specifically focusing in Germany, and this would require them to translate certainly some of their messaging, and that may hire a marketing specialist with linguistic skills. But at the bare minimum, they've been getting usually about 2 leads a month between paid advertising and search engine optimization. So they know that at the minimum, they probably need about 200 suspect leads, and they've come up with a bit of a plan where they think they can actually nurture more than that. They can hedge their bets. They think there's a good chance of at least providing the sales team with more than 250 leads. So that's checking a box. But again, this is all about, it starts with the goal, but then from the goal, it's a matter of determining, okay, the sales team really needs to reverse engineer their entire sales process and establish the pipeline metrics to make sure they understand what they're up against and the volume of activity they need to manage. Now, that word volume is key, because with volume, we now transition into effort. It's going to take time to manage this whole exercise, and it's going to take some resources and money. So now we drop down to the next discussion, which is to say, right, for each stage in the sales process, there's certain tasks and activities that our sales team is responsible for. And we're not going to get into the particulars. We've just sort of populated what a standard B2B might look like as it relates to researching and then engaging a suspect lead through some sort of a cadence that involves a combination of LinkedIn, email, multiple call attempts, so forth and so on. And then moving into a discovery call. There's an initial call, there may be a follow-up email with sort of a summary of findings that leads to a second, more in-depth discovery call that drives towards a finalized needs assessment, so forth and so on. But every sales team not only is mindful of the overall stages in the sales process, but if it's been a while since the company Mapletech has documented each and every task required along the way, this is a good time to do it and to sit down with the sales team and say, right, we need to do a diligent effort of selling into the German market. What's this going to take? And let's now start assigning some hours to this. And so what we've learned talking to the sales team is that for each and every one of these 200 leads, there's about 2.5 hours that are required to manage, administer, and nurture each and every one of those 200 leads through the sales process. And again, for the 40 plus or minus that you're hoping to drive out of those 200, to drive into a more in-depth discovery call, start to finish, that discovery exercise is about another 5 hours for each and every one of those 40 leads. Similarly, when we get into proposal generation, that takes another 2 hours, so forth and so on. What happens is you start to come up, and it's an approximation, but you start to come up with a bit of a rough idea of how many hours of effort would be required in theory to drive this entire sales campaign into the German market. And we're coming up with a number that's just shy of 750 hours. Now, immediately that then requires you to step back and ask, well, wait a minute, what is the typical capacity of a single sales development rep in a year? Now, Colin and I have pre-populated the tool with 1,440 hours, and this is a plus or minus. This is an approximation. This can be edited. You can revisit different scenarios. But we found in the North American market, when you factor in things like staff holidays, vacations, and then even in a given workday, I mean, ultimately with lunch breaks, bio breaks, inevitably sales reps get pulled into internal meetings of one kind or another. We're basically telling you it's safe to assume that a typical sales rep has about 1,440 meaningful hours of outbound sales effort that they can count on in a given year, which is telling you that roughly from a team assignment perspective, it's going to take about 50% of a full-time equivalent sales development rep to drive this entire process, with the majority of that effort going into the front end lead identification, lead qualification, and sales discovery effort. So that's an important finding, because Maple Tech wants to step back now and ask themselves, well, wait a minute, as Colin said, first and foremost, do we even have a hunter on the team? Is there anyone on our sales, service, and business development team that is actively hunting right now, and that feels comfortable doing this and is qualified? If the answer is yes, what else are they doing for the company? Should we be reassigning their effort specifically toward at least 50% of their effort specifically towards this sales campaign into the German market? Or alternatively, is now the time to actually maybe, even though we know we're heading into tough times and we may need to cinch our belt, is now the time to actually invest in an additional sales specialist, and maybe one with some foreign language skills, including not only German, but maybe French. Maybe what we're doing is we're actually creating a full-time job around this individual, and there could be a second or third market we want them to target in Europe. And we're hiring very specifically for that specialist, regardless of what the scenario is. And here's a broader message. One of the reasons why Colin and I really advocate this exercise and looking at all of these numbers, including the sales metrics, the effort to drive the overall sales operation, and the team size and structure. These numbers aren't perfect, obviously. We have no crystal ball. It's an attempt at running a scenario, but we find that even just taking an initial look at these numbers, it tends to unlock an entire conversation for the team about what's truly required, what resources do we already have in place, where do we need to look at additional resources, and ultimately, how much is this going to cost us? If we're going to invest in this, how much do we need? Do we have available cash in the bank, or do we need to lean on potentially a working line of credit in order to help underwrite this exercise? And so quickly, the last point here under budget, you can see now that we're just estimating what the equivalent dollar value would be to engage a rep at 50%. What's the opportunity cost? Well, base salary is probably about $42,000. Plus your marketing support, because we're going to need to adjust some collateral and drive a bit of a digital marketing engine here. It's another 18. And we're thinking, to be fair to the team, about 5% of a $250,000 sales goal is about $12,000, $12,500 in commission and bonus. So already on the labor side, we're looking at about $72,000 plus or minus that we need to set aside. Now, that may be part of an existing budget that's being reallocated. Or again, you may be looking for a working line of credit in order to help underwrite that. And as Colin said, there's other sales expenses you need to consider. We're estimating about $25,000 for certification and permits to sell into Germany. And then there's other items, about $5,000 being spent on translating some sales collateral, another $2,500 doing the same on the website. There were those 2 trade shows. So between trade show expenses and travel and accommodation, that could be another $15,000 for participation, and dropping some money into digital content, paid advertising, and search engine optimization. Plus, you're engaging a consultant to really help you figure out the physical logistics of shipping your gear overseas into Germany. So here we go. We got another $108,000 total bill, as Colin said, $180,000 to get this campaign up and running. Now again, that's against a $250,000 sales target. Some people may step back and say, well, look, that doesn't sound like the best return on investment. But just a reminder, if you land these 5 clients, the understanding is, one, there's going to be some recurring revenue that's going to be coming out of these clients as it relates to maintaining that equipment, retooling over time. But ultimately, the goal here is to prove out the market so that you can convince a distributor to actively begin to rep your product in volume in the German market. Again, this is just a hypothetical scenario with Mapletech Tool, but what we wanted to show you front to back is it's one thing to assess the market, but it's another thing to actually break down step by step, stage by stage, exactly what the metrics are that a sales team needs to drive, and what the resources are going to need to be in order to get the job done. So that's Mapletech as it relates to activating the German market. I'm now just going to quickly, we're getting to the tail end here, everybody. I'm just going to quickly pull up the PowerPoint.
And Chris, actually, I'll just say one thing. There's a lot of solopreneurs out there that would look at Mapletech and go, well, that's not me. We do this for solopreneurs all the time because they need to be that salesperson, right? I mean, aside from running the company, if they're looking at going into a new market and they do the majority of the sales, what going through that exercise allows them to do is to understand the budget and their time required ultimately to properly give that new market a go. And it's a really big discovery for them because they need to carve out that time. And so it doesn't matter if you're a manufacturing company like Mapletech with employees and sales reps, or if you're a solopreneur that's wearing all the hats and you're responsible for sales as well. This is a process that we absolutely advocate for anybody ultimately to truly understand what this is going to take. And as Chris was going in that example, even is there enough of a market out there that we need ultimately? Is this going to, is there enough prospects out there to even actually go after this market? Are we able to find 200 of these prospects within the first 6 months to have a chance of actually selling them? So bottom line is you need a shot of reality here. And that is what this is that we all have dreams of going to new markets, but the reason why we thought this was an opportunity to talk about the how, and it does get into detail for sure, but that detail wins. It does. And that's what separates ultimately companies that make it that don't, we find, is that they go through the process, they go through the detail, they go through the planning, they have a goal, and they have a process actually to execute on, and they understand the money it's going to take and they budget for it. And that's why we thought this was important to share, is that that's the experience we've had. So just looking at the time, Chris, probably it's good to finish off next couple slides. We have another case study. Ultimately, we're not going to walk through, but it is a solopreneur. She's actually from a company called Bright Path, and we just wanted to talk about the difference between, she's looking the US market she does not want to go into at all at this point. It's not that she can't, because she can with the service industry, but she's Canadian. She has put her foot down. She doesn't want US customers at this point. The Canadian market's saturated for her, so she's going to explore Australia. She's a digital marketing agency for eco-friendly brands. And again, very quickly, she's gone through sort of the assessment here. She likes what Australia offers. There is a lot of competitors. She does understand actually that the the focus on what Australians actually focus on, what that means to them, is different from Canada. So she needs to educate herself on that. Legal barriers are low. International tax compliance may come in if she actually makes over a certain amount of money. The time zone's the big one. And this actually, for a lot of our clients, it is going international, is how am I going to work that out? And that different time zone. And finding the windows ultimately that I can work with clients on here, or do I need to find somebody and put them in place half time to be my boots on the ground there? But certainly, I'm going to look at technology to help me with all of this. And then she's got basically a $3,000 budget to do initial marketing down there, and feels ultimately that this is worth a go here. Very low sort of market to entry here. There are competitors. She's going to have to differentiate herself. But we just wanted to show you for the comparison of ultimately what it might take for a service person to go into a new market. It often is not as much budget, anywhere near as much ultimately. It's a little less complex and complicated, but often, again, it's all about marketing at that point. How are you going to get your message across, awareness to these clients, and negotiate the time zone? So that's actually, we just wanted to show you there. At the end of the day, the numbers that come out of this, and Chris and I are obviously big on numbers, they tell you a story and they help you with a strategy ultimately. And it is really important to have these for you, your sales team if you have it, a marketing team if you have it, or your ops as far as supply chain, how much should they prepare for finance to go out and get the right kind of working capital to be able for you to do this, etc. And if you have any board of advisors, obviously they need to be part of this too. Everybody needs to be aligned with why you're going after this market and what it's going to take ultimately to make it tick and make it worthwhile. So that's really sort of the final thing. And Chris.
You bet. And look, thanks again, everybody, for joining us today. We really hope that this in some way prompted some ideas about what next steps are going to look like for you. And again, we always find the devil's in the details. It's not what the next step should be, but how you actually get it done. And so we hope you walk away with a couple of suggestions about best practices and immediate next steps. Again, the summary to-do list here is, if you haven't already, make sure you get that diagnostic snapshot done right away, looking at your sales, reaching out to your customers, reaching out to any distributors you're working with, evaluating the landscape as quickly as possible. Same with your operations and looking upstream to your vendor suppliers. And most importantly, doing a cash assessment. From there, you're going to start to get an idea of what your mission critical goals need to be, either as it relates to retaining and reinforcing your existing book of business or transitioning into new markets. And if you're transitioning into new markets, again, you're going to get this deck and some additional resources. We've left you with a bit of a checklist on what it looks like to assess the market strategically, but then to get into the granular detail of understanding operationally what it takes to activate. And that activation plan leads to a budget, usually, and resource requirements. And where you realize you may not be able to underwrite it yourself, there are a lot of funding options available out there. And even if you can underwrite it yourself, if there are working lines of credit on friendly terms, why not take advantage of them right now? Because absolutely, the provincial and federal governments are lining up to help you out. So that's your to-do list, a bit of a homework assignment for everybody. Colin, back to you.
Yeah, that I think that's it. If we can certainly, if you have any questions now, great. If you want to follow up after going through all of this, I think Samantha is going to have our information ultimately. I think it's on the deck as well, and happy to help and answer any questions that you may have for your specific situation with you. So, yeah, any other final questions at this point, or we can call it a 90 minutes.
I have a question, guys, related to more the product new market. You mentioned a number of times this key decision point around whether to go direct to a country or through, pardon me, through a distributor.
Yeah.
Is that kind of influenced? Does that vary depending on the culture or the type of industry you're talking about? Like, are certain markets easier to go direct, or is in every case you're probably going to end up in a distributor model?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, it does very much depend on the country. In some countries, you're not going to go direct. It just doesn't make any sense
Yeah.
whatsoever. You've got to find a distributor. The reason why we did the direct sale pre-distributor, though, is more and more with our clients, we're finding certainly going into the US and Europe and a lot of places is you want to be in the best position to negotiate with a distributor before you connect with them.
Right.
And you also want to know
have
as
some
much.
traction.
That's it, exactly. So if you are even able to get 10 clients, let's say, ultimately, full bore, full price, and then bring that back to the distributor, ultimately, it's a different conversation that you're going to have with them, right? You're in a much better negotiation position. They're usually far more interested, and sometimes they've even heard of you already at this point. You all of a sudden get a jingling from them because who's
It's an
So
opportunity cost for them. Like with every product category or SKU, the way a distributor thinks is, look, I'm willing to rep one or maybe two products in this particular SKU. I want to rep the best. And if you're unproven in the market, it's going to be very tough to move them off an existing product or convince them of a new product until they've seen that traction. So it's not required, but to Colin's point, it makes your negotiating position and your ability to accelerate that dialogue a lot more likely. Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Thanks, guys.
Yeah. The other route there, Craig, as well as a channel partner, which is different. When we say, I mean, there's a whole bunch of different options for channel partners, but if you can identify a company that's well established in the market that you're going after with a complementary product or service, for instance, so you may identify in Germany a consultant that is a consulting firm that actually works with engineering firms, automotive. They talk to them about best practices, efficiencies, and if that you can get your tools into their offering, then under their umbrella, ultimately they can also introduce you ultimately to some of their clients, which is the other common route.
Right. That's good.
Yeah.
Awesome. Good.
Well, thanks. I think that's it from our end. And
Yeah, so we look forward to sharing this, with our members. You've got some resources you're sharing with Sam as well. This is going to be a great piece to add to our tariff resource page, and lots of good options covered here and good advice. Thank you both.
Okay, thanks again for the opportunity, and I'm sure we'll circle back with you at some point.
Yeah, really good. Okay. Take care.
Take care. Thanks, Samantha.